here's a question for you. How much does the US actually pay for its army and all the military operations that they carry out day after day all over the world? Well, that's precisely what we're going to try and answer in this video. But there's no debate when it comes to one thing, and that's that their military industry is one of the most opaque, most influential, and most powerful industries in the United States. Well, that's true for the United States, as it is for pretty much anywhere else in the world, too. So answering the question that I posed just a moment ago, it means no more or no less than opening a debate with rather large implications. For, in this case, the bill, well, it could be hundreds of billions of dollars. So, having given that warning, let's see what is happening within the corridors of both the Pentagon and the Capitol. Talking about the US Army is going to involve exorbitant figures as well as a huge amount of bureaucracy and political machinery. So big and so opaque is this institution that we can practically talk about a parallel government. You see, in 2015, a report made by the Pentagon itself stated that they had to pay tens of billions, I repeat, tens of billions of dollars every year for extra costs caused by bad management practices in the armed forces. Bad practices such as paying private contractors more money than would be expected in a competitive market.
We're going to be in peril because we're spending dollars like it doesn't matter. Robert L. Stein, Managing Director, Chartwell Capital Management, and former Chairman of the Defense Business Board.
And do not think that it's only the big military industrial companies, those who produce fighters, missiles, and other military equipment. Not at all, in fact. A good part of all of those billions that evaporate each year come from activities such as accounting, logistics, or human resources. You heard that right. In fact, the bureaucracy of the US Armed Forces is so big that it employs no less than 1 million people. Take a look at this graphic from the Washington Post. As you can see, the US Army has almost as many people in its offices doing administrative activities as it does people who are preparing for war or performing national security tasks. And all of this, of course, it comes with an enormous cost. Almost a quarter of the military budget is invested in these types of tasks. Tasks that are, well, let's say important, but are really a quarter of the money? If you consider it another way, all of this bureaucracy alone by itself counts as the third largest military budget in the world, which actually wouldn't be too far behind the second biggest military budget, and that's of China. And that's not all. According to a study by the Department of Defense itself, published in October 2017, approximately 1 out of every 5 installations that the Pentagon has do nothing. They simply sit idle, and they could be closed with no military consequences whatsoever, and this would save millions of dollars per year per each one. But this is something that isn't really quite supported by the politicians in Washington. You see, everything that has to do with the Pentagon and the US Defense Department involves talking about gigantic, hyper-bureaucratic, and very, very expensive structures. Well, as we're going to see later in this video, all of this waste is very important in the political debate. But for now, let's see how much money these military adventures really cost the United States.
The cost of war.
The United States' military adventures aren't really that strange. If we count the Cold War, the United States has been at war since 1941. And besides, we all know it. Since the end of 2001, the US military has been involved in active combat every year. Syria, operations in the Indian Ocean, Africa, Yemen, Eastern Europe, and above all, Iraq and Afghanistan. It doesn't look like it's ending anytime soon. So now, with all of this going on all around the world, can you imagine how much this stuff costs? Well, pay attention here because the numbers are probably more scandalous than you think. But before we get into those numbers, let's mention a quick side note here. One thing is the annual defense budget, and another thing is the operating budget. This means that when we hear about how much the US spends on its army, the cost of wars and military operations themselves aren't usually taken into account. Well, the fact is that since 2001, US taxpayers have spent just in those military adventures alone a whopping $1.7 trillion. $1.7 trillion, by the way, is more than Canada's GDP and almost as much as Italy's. Put another way, in today's dollars, that is is more than twice what the Vietnam War cost, or 5 times that of the cost of the Korean War. But do be careful here, because if you think this is a high figure, well, wait just a minute, because we aren't done yet. The cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, for example, isn't over, and I'm not referring only to the military expenditures that lie ahead, but also to the costs that have already occurred, but which the federal government will have to pay for in the future. Costs such as long-term medical care for ex-combatants due to injuries produced in combat, expenses for veterans, and of course the cost of the debts incurred to finance the war. In total, estimates state that these 2 wars alone are going to end up costing between $4 and $6 trillion. That is just a vast amount of money. To get an idea of the real costs here, this is the equivalent to all of the military expenditure for all European NATO countries for the next 15 to 23 years. All of these military adventures, they are a total financial mess. And you know what? We think that countries should take a look at these bills and be more prudent in the future. For example, when one visits the United States, something that draws the attention is the poor state of its infrastructure. Its roads, its metros, its railroads, etc. In fact, infrastructure in the US has begun to be a serious problem.
We spend trillions and trillions of dollars outside of our nation, but we can't build a road, a highway, a tunnel, a bridge in our own nation. And we watch everything falling into disrepair.
Well, only with what the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have cost, the United States could have the best infrastructure in the world.
Past 30 years, the Americans had 13 wars, spending $14.2 trillion. What if they spent a part of that money on building up the infrastructure? What if the money spent on the Middle East, Middle West of the United States, developing the industry there? That could be changed a lot. So it's not the other countries steal jobs from you guys. It is your strategy.
So far, I think things are quite clear. We have now seen how much Washington's military adventures around the world have cost the American people. Now, I think it's going to be interesting to see how much the federal government really spends every year on defense. And I'm going to say that if you haven't been surprised so far, you probably are about to be.
We dominate the sky. We dominate the sea. We dominate the land and space.
The true military expenditure.
We all know more or less that the US defense budget is by far the largest in the world. Consider 2017 as an example. In this year, $560 billion was spent on defense. And of course, we also have to add that $60 billion for operating expenses. This is approximately 3 times the military expenditure of China, or 9 times the military expenditure of Russia. However, these amounts don't include all of the expenses that the military world generates for the US government. Consider, for example, the cost of medical treatment for those wounded in combat, or the costs of veteran expenses. Have a quick look at this graph. Yes, as you can see, if we take all of these expenses into account, the armed forces expenses rise above $900 billion per year. That's nearly $1 trillion. And we still need to consider national security expenses like financing intelligence agencies such as the CIA. But even if we only take the Department of Defense and nuclear weapons budget, which is $620 billion, we can see how the military effort in GDP terms is one of the largest in the world. However you want to look at those numbers, they are exorbitant. But before we finish answering today's question, let's just wait for a moment, because the US military dominance is somewhat less impressive when we consider the following factors. First, price difference. That is, you can't buy the same things with $1 in the US as you can with $1 in China. If we correct this, we would see that the US military expenditure would be equal to the sum of China and Russia's military expenditure. It's still an enormous amount, but it's not as impressive. And second, and this is really important, we have to consider how things have changed in recent years. Allow me to explain here. In constant dollars, that is, adjusting for inflation, real defense expenditures have actually fallen since 2010 by 25%. This is unquestionably the largest reduction in decades. And in a way, this is what is greatly worrying many analysts and politicians in Washington, especially the Republican Party.
I understand we're in an election year. I understand all that, but how in the world do you refuse to take up legislation that its only purpose is to defend this nation, which is under assault? We rely on these young men and women. We rely on them to defend the nation, and now we won't even act to train, arm, equip, pay, and care for them?
Could it be that despite all the money that the US is spending today on defense, it still isn't enough? Well, let's consider this.
A waning power?
Since the fall of the Soviet Union,
Повестка дня исчерпана. Первый съезд народных депутатов объявляется закрытым.
And the consequent end of the Cold War, it could be expected that the size of the United States' armed forces has decreased substantially. We're talking about fewer submarines, fewer aircraft carriers, fewer bombers, fewer soldiers, etc., etc. However, new equipment has arrived, such as the F-22 Raptor, the B-2 bomber, the F-35, a new class of aircraft carriers, new cruisers, and among other things, high-precision drones and missiles. Well, all of this technological innovation has had two consequences. On the one hand, it has increased the US's military capabilities, but on the other hand, it has altered equipment and operational costs. And of course, as we've seen, the budget has been decreasing in recent years.
Years of underfunding have given us a weakened force that, despite the hard work of our brave troops, is ill-equipped to handle the missions we keep throwing at it. Edwin J. Fulner, founder and president of the Heritage Foundation.
Due to all of this, the Republican Party, and also it must be said a large part of the Democratic Party, seem to have something quite clear in their minds. The military budget must be increased.
We currently have the smallest army since 1940.
Our Navy is at its smallest size since 1917.
I would send weapons to Ukraine.
The first thing we need to do to make America stronger is to strengthen our military.
The ex-candidate to the presidency and famous Arizona Senator John McCain, who incidentally is the chairman of the Armed Services Committee of the Senate, is one of the politicians who is most committed to this issue and has proposed raising the military budget to $800 billion. They say that the current scarce military budget, for example, caused the accidents that the US Navy has had in the Pacific.
U.S. Navy relieves Admiral in charge of 7th Fleet in wake of deadly disaster at sea.
This is as well as causing new and emerging threats such as that of North Korea or an increasingly strong China. And as you can imagine, dealing with these increasing threats is not going to be cheap. Only redoing and modernizing their nuclear arsenal, that is, nuclear weapons, bombers, missiles, and submarines, as Trump promised, implies an investment in the next 30 years of more than $1.2 trillion. However, if you spend more than anyone else, much more in fact, and you are still not the leader, shouldn't you perhaps be rethinking your strategy? Shouldn't the US perhaps modify its role in some way so it's not as involved in so many conflicts around the world? And further, there's the question of whether military expenditure really helps national security, or does it really just help the arms industry? And it's important to note that that arms industry does generously finance lobbyists and political campaigns. Well, they are the questions, and the answers, they're pretty much open. But now it's your turn. Do you think that the US should increase its military budget? Well, leave your answer in the comment section below, as well as in this survey. And I really hope you enjoyed that video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos every Monday and Thursday. And as always, check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.
We currently have the smallest army since 1940.
Our Navy is at its smallest size since 1917.
I would send weapons to Ukraine.
The first thing we need to do to make America stronger is to strengthen our military.